Hey YouTube, Wyatt Paints here. Today I will be painting 1/8 scale Michelangelo sculpted by Creative Geek. Before we get started, I want to thank all of you new subscribers for joining me. Our painting pantheon has passed 50 strong, and I can't express how grateful I am to you all. And an extra thank you to Creative Geek for noticing and showing some love to a new channel like mine. With that said, let's get painting. Like Leo, Mikey comes on a similar base, so we should treat it the same so he and his brothers can stand together on a shelf like a team. Again, since I primed in gray, I'm going to skip straight to the shading with Nuln Oil. I feel it's best not to overthink this step as we'll have plenty of harder choices to make later. For me, those choices were a bit harder as I've been dealing with an ear and nose infection. So if you hear a difference in my voice, that's why. Now that the shade is dry, I dry brushed on cold gray and stole gray to finish off the stone look of the base. Once it matched Leo's base, it was time to move on to his shell. Here's where I hit my first road bump. The first time I painted this was day 2 of being sick. I ended up rushing through it just to get some sleep. The next day when I checked my work, I was not happy with what I made. The shade was splotchy and the highlight was way too heavy. So I had to start over, and that means rebasing it with P3 Bootstrap Brown. Thankfully with acrylic paints, you can do this a couple of times without losing too much detail, so long as you keep your layers thin. Keep this in mind next time you're not in love with what you're painting, as it happens to everybody for some reason or another. The brown was followed by a wash of Argax Earthshade, then I slowly dry brushed with Desert Yellow. I gotta say, I was already impressed with Leonardo's sculpt and the details that Creative Geek added to visually describe the character, and I'm happy to say I was even more impressed with Mikey. They could have just reused the same shell and I would have been happy, but instead they gave him his own unique shell with extra details to show off his playful nature. Moving on to Mikey's skin. I want him to have a brighter green compared to his brothers to reflect his lighthearted nature, so I based him in a goblin green. This is when I noticed the next thing that impressed me about this sculpt. Canonically, Mikey is the youngest and smallest of the turtles, and thankfully Creative Geek reflected that, as he's significantly smaller than Leo. It's the little things like this that let me know the sculptor really cares about what they're doing. Next, I shaded his skin in Bellatane green, like Leo. Overshading here would tone down the vibrancy of Michelangelo's skin, so a lighter touch was needed. Before I moved to the highlight, I did a heavy dry brush of the Goblin green. This again helped re-establish the higher starting green tone. For his first highlight, I used the same Scorpion green as I used last time, but since this won't be our final highlight, I was a bit more aggressive with the dry brush. When you're planning on using multiple dry brush colors to highlight, being aggressive and broad early and transitioning to a softer, more focused dry brush can give you a gradual transition with very little effort. And for that softer dry brush, I used a nearly neon light livery green from Vallejo. While using this, I did a heavy focus on his face and shoulders. When painting his chest, I was again surprised with how different Mike was from Leo, so I opted to use the same base color starting with Desert Yellow. For the shade, I went a bit darker than before and slapped on an Argax Earth shade, because I feel Mikey being the youngest probably didn't wash behind his ears as often as he should. Do turtles even have ears? They do, right? For the highlight, I dry brushed Desert Yellow followed by P3 Menoth White Base, being sure not to get too heavy-handed so that I can keep that dirty wash strong. Next, I wanted to handle his wraps. Now previously, I had a thought of each brother having slightly different wraps, but as I realized how much personality the sculptor put into each of these models, I decided to have the wraps to be one of those things that brings them together, kind of like the bases. I went with a Menoth base followed by a Seraphim Sepia wash and a dry brush of the Menoth. This is where I noticed a little extra detail of those small plates on his feet. I had to start thinking about what those plates were. Are they metal plates to protect his feet, or maybe stone weights for training. In the end, I decided they were a little bit of both and chose to paint them like cast iron plates that he had strapped on his feet to give his kicks a little extra oomph. So a careful base in black, followed by a very light dry brush of Army Painter's shiny silver, got me most of the way there. It was still a little bit brighter than I wanted, so I stippled on some Nuln Oil. An easy cheat mode for this is to start dotting your shade in the darkest spots that you want and work your way to the smaller and lighter spots. This way, when I got to those lighter spots, there was less shade on my brush, giving me much more control as to where it goes. Next, Mikey was wearing knee and elbow pads, which makes thematic sense as he was an avid skateboarder. Hats off again to the sculptor. I wanted to keep these simple and similar to Leo, so a cold gray base followed by a Nuln Oil wash. Here's an easy shade level up tip. I let these dry upside down so that the washes pool underneath the folds. If you let gravity pull the wash down towards the feet, it ends up having them sit on top of the high points and fighting with your highlight. Once ready, a dry brush of cold gray softens those hard shade edges, and a highlight of Stonewall Gray finishes off those pads. I wanted to do a dry fit to make sure that my skin tone matches and that those iron plates didn't look too similar to the base. And besides the little print error on his legs, which the skirt's gonna hide anyway, they look great. Now here's the part I was kind of dreading, painting the orange. Now first, understand I was kind of out of it and completely messed up hitting the record button for the base coat. Thankfully you didn't miss anything interesting. Just know orange is a pain to paint because like yellow, orange doesn't cover anything well, even other oranges. So best advice I can give is resist the temptation to slather on a thick coat and just power through with thin coat after thin coat to build up the opacity. Or as I like to say, paint it until you don't hate it. But my mess up is your gain, as we can get right on to the next step. Personally, I don't like shading orange or yellow on the account of how many layers it takes to base, so I chose to just base it with the darkest orange I wanted, in this case P3 Inferno Orange, then highlight my way up to a yellow. I chose to get there in two steps. First, P3 Ember Orange. Due to orange and yellow's notorious coverage, dry brushing lighter colors on top treats the base layer as more of an undercoat or pre-shading. Similar to pre-highlighting, these thin layers are more of a filter for the color underneath. Once I established the tone with Ember, I moved on to P3 Cygnus Yellow. Again, we can use the poor coverage of yellow in our favor and be a bit more heavy-handed with a dry brush than usual. Now it's time to turn our attention to the details, starting with his shell. This features a Hanya mask, which was the first time I was confused by the sculpting choice, as these are typically used to represent evil or jealous female spirits. This was held in place by a Shimenawa rope, which is used for purification. Perhaps the artist imagined Mikey having some kind of ex whose spirit haunts him. Leave a comment if you have any ideas who this could be. With that said, I know these ropes are made of hemp, so I based them and the mask in Vallejo dead flesh. Then they each got a wash of Reichland flesh. The mask got a dry brush up to a smooth porcelain color, using Vallejo bone white, while the Shimenawa got a careful layering of the same bone white. Now here's the time you really want to slow down and paint clean to preserve the shade on the braids of the rope. Since the rope on the shell looks so nice, I decided to paint the rest of the ropes in the same way. Dead flesh base, followed by a heavy wash on the braids, and a careful layering of bone white to highlight. I repeated these same steps for the ropes on his hands and his feet. To finish off the belt, I gave the buckle a coat of Cycrox bronze, followed by a heavy earth-shaped wash. Coming into the home stretch, I started getting those details I held off on earlier, like his teeth. Unlike Leo, who had a closed-mouth smirk, Mikey was definitely showing off his fun side with a smile. I didn't want to go too bright with him, so I based them in bone white, followed by a light sepia shade. Once that was dry, I went back in with the bone white to refine the shape of his teeth. And if you're careful here and leave a bit of shade separating each tooth, you you end up with a subtle gradient without much effort. Just do your best to get those shade lines as thin as possible. Next, I dropped in white for the eyes. Again, no pupils. If it's good for Batman, it's good for my turtles. I had a bit of overpaint here, but a bit of amber orange fixed that right up. His clasp got a coat of cold gray and a Nolan oil wash. Then, just for fun, I threw some Cycrox bronze on the buttons. Lastly, his nunchucks. I wanted them to be a lacquered wood, so I used bootstrap brown and an earth shade. I did this pretty fast and loose as I figured they would be well-worn weapons. The rope got based in cold gray with a Nolan oil wash. Finally, I wanted them to have a little bit of pop, so I gave them bronze caps. And with that, Michelangelo's done. 2 down, 2 to go. It'll be a few days before I can start printing Raphael, as I'm waiting for resin to be shipped. In the meantime, I will have a few smaller projects coming up to fill in the gap. If you'd like to support this sculptor, check out their Patreon, Creative Geek, or if you'd like to get this model in particular, you can find their storefront and CG Trader in the links below. They usually run a rotating sale of their previous release models there. Finally, if you like this video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.